we've seen Donald Trump say Russia could be back into a G8 kind of scenario, into the G7. He said, we want to denuclearize with Russia. We want to cut these nuclear weapons down to size. There's too many of them. Also have seen, I'm going to talk to Russia and China, and we're all going to cut military spending by 50%.
We have the greatest military equipment in the world. We're building it. At some point, when things settle down, I'm going to meet with China, and I'm going to meet with Russia in particular, those two, and I'm going to say, there's no reason for us to be spending almost $1 trillion on military. There's no reason for you to be spending $400 billion. China's going to be at 400 billion. We're at $1 trillion. We're going to be at close to $1 trillion. We can settle this on, we can spend this on other things. We don't have to spend this on military because, we were trying to de-escalate nuclear.
As we've discussed, there is this obvious shift away from a kind of a Russia-focused foreign policy, perhaps more toward China and Asia Pacific. But I'm curious if you believe that one of Trump's strategies, if we can call it that here, is to try to break away Russia. This is not a new thing, attempt. But try to break away Russia from, he said BRICS is dead, right? Why would anyone want to be in BRICS?
And it's the Gulf of America too, right? Because I say so, right? Okay. So first of all, with regards to nuclear agreements, obviously at some point, I don't know if it will be in the next 4 years, but the major nuclear powers have got to sit down and hash out some type of new successor, probably to New START. Probably not just between the US and Russia, but between also China and other major nuclear, the UK, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, even North Korea now, right? There has to be some type of agreement, at least among the majority of those nuclear powers. And it will have to probably address, if maybe it's too expansive, but things like hypersonic weapons and AI and underwater nuclear drones and a lot of these other things have got to be considered as well in a successor to the Cold War security architecture. That should be done. Now, do I believe that either Russia or the United States are going to cut down anywhere in the near future on their number of nuclear weapons? No, not at all. That's not realistic. I don't think the Russians are willing to do that. They very much rely on their nuclear deterrent. They may not be interested in a quantitative arms race where, with New START gone, they start building large numbers of new nuclear weapons. I think they're happy with the number they have. But there's obviously a qualitative new arms race, right? Where older weapons are replaced with new, more modern, more powerful, more accurate, faster, right? Hypersonic, Oreshnik, all of these things, right? There is a new arms race that has been going on since the U.S. pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty back in 2003, but it is becoming very visible now. So there will have to be some type. Whether that comes during Trump's administration or not, I don't know. That's a big deal. That will be a big, huge world-shaping effort. I do believe that Trump, all things given, that his first instinct is to try to, for the U.S. to get its way with economic. And obviously he has this fixation with tariffs. It goes back to he fixates on the period of William McKinley's presidency, right, at the very beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 18th century, as the golden age of America. And he sees tariffs as the tool to get there. And he would like to deal with China and Iran and other countries with tariffs. He's somehow fixated on that. But when that doesn't work, right, I don't believe that Trump is adverse to using military and other force to get the U.S. way. I mean, he did assassinate Qasem Soleimani and several Iraqi generals. Let's remember of that. Something that was, if the Iranian government didn't have the level of restraint that they do, would, it can certainly be considered an act of war, right? So don't believe too much in the Trump peacemaker thing, even if he would at first instinct try to avoid major conflict. He certainly wouldn't shy away from it if he believed it was necessary for American interests either. And obviously China is what he's focusing on in that regard. Why does he want to move U.S. troops and equipment out of Europe? Because he wants to move them to the Pacific, right? And you can say, oh, that's just to contain China. Well, everything is to contain China until China doesn't want to be contained. And there we go. Russia did not want to be contained right up with NATO, right up against their border either, and neither does China. And this whole issue of Taiwan is a whole nother story. And Trump hasn't made his exact opinions of Taiwan. He said some interesting things. But that is something that has yet to be determined. But obviously he does want to focus on China and the Pacific in whatever way. Do not expect military spending in the US or Russia to go down significantly. If the conflict in Ukraine somehow miraculously is brought to an end, expect Russian military spending to decline, perhaps even to halve, back down to 4 or 5% of the economy, but don't expect it to shrink the size of the Russian or the U.S. military by half. That's not going to happen. That's not within Russia's interests, right? Russia has just built up this powerful, experienced, modern, conventional military that is a peer adversary, if not stronger in some ways than the U.S.'s military. They're not just going to give that up, nor should they. Keep in mind, whatever Trump does or doesn't do in the next 4 years, Trump is gone in 4 years, right? Unless he declares himself God Emperor. Then Russia will have to deal with the next U.S. president, which is one of the reasons why Putin is, whatever Trump may believe or want, Russia needs to keep in mind that the next U.S. president could reverse everything that Trump has done, just like Trump is trying to reverse everything that Joe Biden did, right? And that is just something that all countries increasingly will have to take into account with the United States whenever there is an exchange of power, that it could bring dramatic domestic and now even potentially international policy differences.
The United States has definitely been opening up all of the fronts and getting bogged down everywhere. We've seen certain elements of, especially the neocons, talk about, well, how can we pull away Russia and China from each other?
Yeah, Trump and a lot of the MAGA people obviously at some level have that in the back of their heads. Oh, we can bring Putin against China. Right? Fantasize all you want. It is never going to happen. Right? The leaders of China and the Soviet Union made that mistake in the Cold War. And if you want to take a look at any single one factor, looking at one factor would be a mistake, but probably the single biggest factor to the U.S. winning the Cold War, if you want to say that, was them exploiting the Sino-Soviet split. And the Russian and Chinese leaders of today are well aware of that. They're well aware of the strength they have together. They're very comfortable working with each other and having each other's back. While, the plan, of course, was for Russia to deal with Europe as both a business partner and a competitor, and for China to deal with the U.S. as a business, as a competitor and as a business partner. Frenemies, if you want to call it that way. But, the whole Ukraine thing happened and that kind of, had those plans. But Russia and China complement each other. They're very comfortable working together. Both leaderships have strong long-term strategic visions for their country. And whatever Putin may say, and whatever, he is never going to give that up. Let's be honest. Putin knows how to play Trump, right? Every leader in the world tries to play Trump, right? They know his ego. They know he's susceptible to flattery, right? And that he does all politics as if, he's doing a selfie stream, right, with a megaphone on, and to the American and to some extent the global audience, and they may say things at various times that play to Trump's ego, and Putin certainly will as well. But don't doubt that every time they do that, that Russia and China aren't then getting together and exchanging notes, right? And this is what we said to him, and this is how he responded, and blah blah blah. That is happening at a level and a frequency that people in the West, that the West's geopolitical experts severely underestimate.
When Donald Trump reached out to Xi Jinping right at the beginning of his administration, what happened directly afterward was that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping had a conversation. I don't even know if it was 24 hours after that conversation, but it was directly after. So
hey, be prepared for Trump to try to renew his bromance with Kim Jong-un and to pull Kim Jong-un away from Putin as well. That's not likely to happen either. But they may all slap each other in the back in a summit at some point.
And here's what Wang Yi had to say to questions at the Munich Security Conference.
Country, and based on our mutual trust, we built a comprehensive strategic partnership. So exchanges between China and Russia are normal exchanges between countries. You mentioned, can China stop buying gas from Russia? Well, I'd like to ask this. If China does not buy gas from Russia, which country can provide so much gas as to meet the needs of Chinese people? It's not possible.
I don't think we're going to see the United States pump its fracked gas.
That's really important what he just said there. Russia and Chinese leadership trust each other. That has built up over the last 2-3 decades. Neither the U.S. nor the Chinese leader trust the U.S. leadership or the European leadership, and they have both complained about it endlessly, right? And that is, people may really underestimate. Again, don't be surprised if Putin plays Trump a bit. If Trump really pushes you can side with us against China, and Putin says, yeah, sure we are, right? Be prepared for a little bit of that rhetorically. But don't ever doubt that Russia and China aren't then exchanging notes behind Trump's back whenever that happens, because it is absolutely happening. And if there's one thing that I am absolutely confident about, right? I'm not 100% confident in the Russian-Indian relationship. It's a good relationship. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% confident in, in any other relationships, but, or even the Russian-Iranian relationship, which is a very good relationship and getting better. The Russian-Chinese relationship is the bedrock pillar of resistance to the United States, be that against U.S.-led Western hegemony or some renewed type of U.S. empire under Trump, right? It is that pillar. It is not only the pillar, the foundation of resistance to the United States, but ultimately the pillar, the bedrock foundation of a multipolar world is the bilateral relationship between China and Russia. Everything else, there's a whole house to build, but it must be built on that foundation. And that is one thing I have no doubt about.
Well, what does the United States offer here? You talked a lot about negotiations between Russia and the United States potentially coming to a big rut, possibly because of the lack of.
Russia doesn't want back in the G8. Russia doesn't. This is Trump's latest.
What are they going to offer?
Russia's been clear about that many times. The G8 was already a useless talking shop. Russia has said multiple times before They're not interested in rejoining that, right? They've got the G20. They've got BRICS, right? Why would they want the G8? They don't want the G8. It's not a reward, right? It's not a, oh, you can give up Zaporozhye. Sure, if we give you the G8, right? No, that's not going to happen. Also, one thing you don't hear Russia talking about in the context of a Ukraine settlement, at least, it's not a priority, is sanctions. It's not a priority for Russia. It's not. They've adjusted. The Russian economy is growing. Now, doubtless new, revenue would increase in some ways, but there are lots of arguments to be made that, at least in part, the growth in the Russian economy that Russia is experiencing is not despite Western sanctions. It is because of them. So sanctions, again, sanctions relief would be welcome, I think, not by everyone in Russia, right? There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money off of those sanctions being in place as they've replaced Western companies and the like with domestic production and so forth, right? But Russia is not willing to sacrifice its geopolitical interests in Ukraine or its humanitarian interests in Ukraine for sanctions relief. It has endured these sanctions as a result of its interventions, and it is not going to give up the goals of the interventions for sanctions relief. Even for, first of all, it doesn't believe that the West can just reverse sanctions, because Jackson Vanik took decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to be removed. But regardless, it is not a priority because Russia is doing okay with the sanctions in place, right? With more than 24,000 sanctions in place, and Russia's stronger than ever and more independent, and putting themselves back into a position where that can be used as leverage over them. Do we really want or need back in SWIFT? It's not a priority, right? It's not the first thing. The West thinks that they're somehow going to use that. We'll allow you to reopen Nord Stream if you give up in Ukraine. Get out of here. Just get out of here. It's not going to happen.
Not even with all of the hope that people are putting into the Trump administration and its early talks with Russia. They're not offering sanctions relief openly, and likely not even in closed doors, because openly they've said, well, we could use sanctions to strengthen and force Russia to the table. And this is something that almost everybody from Trump has said.
Well, if the first 24,000 sanctions didn't do it, the next 500 will surely do it, right?
Right. Like, and then they say more effective enforcement. What does that even mean, Mark? I don't need more effective enforcement.
It's clear what that means, right? Because there's nothing else they can say. The U.S. and Russia actually have very limited economic exposure, right? Uranium and other things that the U.S. actually needs. When they use those words, tightening sanctions, what they really mean is sanctioning the rest of the world into obeying Western sanctions on Russia, so-called secondary sanctions, right? And that's what they're talking about. They're talking about sanctioning Chinese companies and Indian companies and China and Indian banks and the countries as a whole to try to force them to stop trading with Russia. That's what they're talking about when they talk. If you take a look at the last rounds of sanctions, the majority of them have all been sanctions, secondary sanctions, going after companies in Turkey and the UAE and elsewhere to try to, by diktat, force the rest of the world to stop trading with Russia. It hasn't worked very well for them so far, because at the end of the day, they don't want to be dictated who they can't and can't trade with. And in a world of finite resources that everyone needs, like oil and gas and grain and metals and chemicals and other things, that Russia is the biggest supplier of the global market to, they inevitably take a look at those sanctions and then just ignore them and try to find ways to go around them, right? Because they're always written to an exact legal degree, and then there's a workaround. And inevitably, that's what they do. They don't challenge them directly, right? They just ignore them and go around them. And that is what will happen going forward as well. India just signed a huge long-term oil supply contract with Russia. They're interested in big LNG sales as well. We know Russia and China are constantly in negotiations to open the Power of Siberia 2 and other pipelines and LNG. That is, they can't force China and India and Turkey and other countries to stop trading with Russia. They can't. They may try, but they haven't succeeded in the last 3 years, and they're not going to in the next 4.